It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Margaret Grace Love, who was born in Mount Holly, North Carolina, and is excited to be teaching in her home state. So that's nice. She received her bachelor's degree from Rhodes College, her master's from the University of Chicago, and her PhD from Tufts University. She has worked in publishing in both Chicago and New York, and prior to coming to NC Wesleyan, she taught classes at Tufts, Wheelock College, Emmanuel College, and was visiting assistant professor of English at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater for 2 years. Her research interests center on global post-colonial literature, with a particular focus on Caribbean fiction and narrative theory. Her non-research interests center on coffee, movies, travel when it's safe, and dancing. She's also very happy to be singing with the Wesleyan Singers this year and, in fact, later today. Her current book project, Radical Canons, explores the rhetorical and political use of epigraphs in 20th century Caribbean fiction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Love.
Thank you all so much for coming. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So my talk today is entitled Radical Canons, Epigraphs, and Authority in Caribbean Fiction. And this is based on my current book project, which is also based in turn on my dissertation. And I want to give you a little bit of an overview of some key terms and some historical context, and then I'm going to kind of walk you through the main arguments of each chapter in my dissertation. I'm going to spend a little extra time on the last chapter because that sort of opens the door to some of the new work that I'm doing to expand my dissertation into my book project. So I will hopefully ask you to bear with me if I do a little more reading towards the end of the presentation, because that work is newer and it's not in my brain and body in quite the same way as some of this older stuff. So we will start. What is an epigraph? Anybody know what I'm even talking about? Anybody outside the English department familiar with epigraphs? Yeah.
It's a quote from someone else that introduces your topic.
Yeah, exactly. A quote generally from someone else that introduces a work, right? Not to be confused with an epitaph. This is not what I'm talking about, right? Not the thing that goes on people's gravestones. So to give you a little bit of a hint about where I came to this project, I was doing a lot of reading for my oral examinations, for my comprehensive exams, and I noticed that a lot of the works that I was reading, particularly from the decade of the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s in Caribbean fiction, were using epigraphs and using them in a very structural way. And I thought this was really interesting. I am a very detail-oriented person, and this is detail-oriented to another level. I got very fixated on these little fragments of text that are introducing the different sections or different works that I was reading. So I also wanted to get into a little bit of the history of the epigraph, because when you think about it, it's kind of a strange thing to do. Why would people start a novel or a book that they're writing with the words of somebody else, right? Like, why would you give somebody else the first word in your work that you're writing? So to give a little bit of background and context for the history of the epigraph, I want to talk a little bit about the work of Leah Price, Gerard Genette, and Richard Watts. So one of the things that Gerard Genette talks about in his work Paratext, Thresholds of Interpretation, is the history of the epigraph. Where do these things come from? Epigraphs started a little bit more as author mottos, and they tended to be quotations from classical works in Latin and Greek that expressed something about the author's disposition or intention, and these sort of morphed into what we now think of as the modern day use of the epigraph. But at least initially, these were still generally in Latin or quotations from classical poetry. And one of the things that Leah Price theorizes about epigraphs is that many of the novels in the 18th century, when the novel was a relatively new and young genre, were trying to borrow some of the prestige of poetry as a genre for the genre of the novel, trying to sort of legitimize the novel as not any longer quite this lowbrow thing that was often associated with pornography because most of the early novels came from France. And yes, France, where the porn comes from. So Jeanette is sort of talking us through this early history of the epigraph, but he, as one would expect from a French scholar, he tends to focus on the use of the epigraph in France, and Price is bringing that history from the French into the English tradition. And I thought it was really interesting that no one was talking about the difference between epigraphs from a different cultural context. And I actually found this work by Richard Watts that began to address this question. And he was looking at prefaces to texts coming out of sub-Saharan and Northern Africa, right? Particularly a lot of Algerian texts that were coming out of that region. And prefaces that were introducing those texts. And so he's looking at the post-colonial valences of introducing a text in French, right, that's coming out of a colonial region of France, right? And so he's starting to consider how does a power differential between the author who's writing the text and the author that the epigraph is coming from, how does that affect how we understand the function of the epigraph in the text? And so I thought, well, this is sort of the kind of thing I want to do, but I want to look at, instead of prefaces, I want to look at epigraphs. And I noticed when I started to consider the epigraph in a more diachronic way that you had, to go back for a second, my initial project overview was looking at this sort of timeline of texts, starting in 1960 with The Pleasures of Exile by George Lamming, which is a book of essays, The Palace of the Peacock by Wilson Harris, which is a novel, Escape to an Autumn Pavement by Andrew Salke, which is another novel, and then some novels that come out later in the decade, specifically In Absence of Ruins by Orlando Patterson, The Adventures of Catullus Kelly by Andrew Salke again, right? So we have sort of the bookends of the 1960s, right, beginning and end of the decade. And in the 1960s, a lot is going on politically in terms of the relationship between the Caribbean islands that these authors are from and England, where most of them are living and writing. So you'll notice in 1962, Jamaica gains independence. In 1966, Guyana and Barbados both gained independence, although interestingly, Barbados becomes a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, and they've retained the Queen as the head of state, and they have just now, in literally like the last year, put forward a petition to remove her as the head of state and have an actual like prime minister, a head of state in Barbados. So this makes my research feel like wonderfully current, which is very exciting. But so I looked at this list of texts and I thought, this is great, except there's no women here, right? And this is focusing on a period when there was a huge boom in Caribbean publishing and fiction coming out of the UK because it was really difficult, if not impossible, to establish yourself and live and succeed as a writer while still living in the Caribbean, in part because there was no infrastructure for book publishing there, right? All of the publishers and the factories and the presses were in England. So these guys came over, a lot of them came over for education, right? They came to get degrees in England, and then they stayed to become writers. But I thought, I gotta get at least one woman author in my dissertation somehow. So I cheated a little. And I added Michelle Cliff's No Telephone to Heaven, which 1987 isn't really in the 60s anymore, but I sort of make a case for, because part of the novel is set in the 60s, like, this sort of counts. So that was my way of getting at least one woman author on my list, and a queer woman at that, which is great. So I noticed when I started looking at these texts that there seemed to be a shift happening, not just in their political resonances in terms of what was going on inside the texts, but in what they were epigraphing and how they were using those epigraphs. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as I go through, but the shift seems to me to occur from the beginning of the decade to the end, that in terms of how the epigraphs are working, right, that they are going from a sort of critique and challenge of the text that they're pulling from to then sort of connecting and conferring authority on the text that they're pulling from. And if we go back for a second to my slide on Jeanette, right, that generally Jeanette theorizes that epigraphs are used to create a gesture of affiliation, right? They're the author trying to make some kind of connection between themselves and the author of the epigraph texts. So it's less about the text itself than about the presence of the epigraph and the connection that they're making to that author, right? And thinking about it as a sort of password of intellectuality is the phrase that Jeanette uses, right? So demonstrating like, you know, this is part of the literary group that I want to be a member of, right? This is who I want to associate myself with, and also look at all the cool stuff I've read, which I know all of us English folks can relate to. So basically, this is just an excuse for me to show this incredibly sexy photo of George Lamming. There's some really great photographs of the writers from this period. So George Lamming is a writer from Barbados, and he is known for his novels, but one of the first things that I read of his was this book of essays called The Pleasures of Exile. And he's talking a lot about not just his relationship to his living in England when he's from Barbados, but specifically because he is a writer, his relationship to literature and his understanding of what literature is and how one can be a writer when one is Black. And so in The Pleasures of Exile, he includes an epigraph for each of the interconnected essays. And among those epigraphs are Shakespeare, James Joyce, John Donne, and so he's using these very well-established writers that are thought of as canonical, even though James Joyce is a little bit more current and controversial in that he's also a writer who's in a colonial relationship or a colonially inflected relationship to England. And so one of the things that Lamming's essays in the book do is they try to reorient our relationship to Shakespeare's The Tempest, and specifically to the character of Caliban. And this seems sort of very established and old hat now, but in 1960, it was definitely a reframing that was relatively new and innovative, right? That he's thinking about the character of Caliban and what that represents in terms of the figure of the native in the English imagination in the 17th century. And so I thought I would give you just a little taste of what he's doing with these moments, right? So this is one of the quotations that leads into one of Lamming's essays. And this is Caliban saying, "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will turn about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I had then waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked I cried to dream again." And on the one hand, this is meant to be a sort of melancholy moment with Caliban. But if we look at it again, we can see this is Caliban as the indigenous resident of the island demonstrating his knowledge of it for the interlopers, for the invaders, right? So this is claiming Caliban as somebody who has knowledge, right? As somebody who has agency, as somebody who has understanding and ways of knowing that aren't familiar to the people who have come there, right? And also thinking about Caliban as somebody in a position of authority. He says to them, "Be not afeard." He's telling them what to do, right? And so we're giving a different focus, right? A different framing on this moment in the text than the one that Shakespeare might have expected from us or for us. Excuse me. And to go back just briefly to The Palace of the Peacock, Wilson Harris has sometimes been described as the James Joyce of the Caribbean, in that his books are really confusing. So I will sort of sketch over that one very briefly and just tell you he's using epigraphs from Yeats, from Donne, from the Bible, from William Blake. And a lot of what he's doing there is sort of recalibrating or recasting literature as not belonging just to the English and reframing the history of Guyana as not starting with the arrival of Europeans, and so pointing back to a longer history, right? Something that goes back further, including in terms of the Bible, but also claiming ownership over that, saying this belongs to us as much as it does to you. And the Yeats quote is, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by," from Yeats's, what's the name of the poem? See, this is where you run into the issue with my dissertation, is that I not only have to be an expert on these 6 books, but I also have to be an expert on every single thing that they quote from, which is really annoying. So, excuse me. So the Yeats poem that is quoted on his tombstone, right? And what it's saying, go ahead. I don't think so. Anyway, Ben Bulben, that's it, under Ben Bulben. So anyway, the point being that he says, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." And one of the things that we can read that to say in terms of this novel, where 6 of the main characters are dead, but also not. So he's troubling this idea that life and death are these very well-defined, mutually exclusive things, and using Yeats to do it, but doing it in the context of an Amerindian mystical understanding of these concepts, right? So he's using that text to create a very different framing that than would be familiar or accustomed to Western readers. So that's sort of generally what I'm going for in the first chapter, is to point out how these 2 particular texts are reclaiming but also recasting these moments in canonical English texts and taking a fragment and changing how we understand or read it, right? Recasting the emphasis in order to make a point, specifically a point critiquing the myth of cultural superiority from England. So then we get to chapter 2. Andrew Selke, he was sort of my lead-in. This was the Escape to an Autumn Pavement was the book I got obsessed with that sort of birthed this whole dissertation. But so one of the things that this novel is doing is told in 3 sections, and each section has an epigraph. And there's 3 epigraphs at the beginning. And the 3 epigraphs at the beginning are Max Beerbohm, T.S. Eliot, and David Jones. Now these are all, in some sense, English poets, right? But T.S. Eliot is an American English poet, and David Jones is a Welsh English poet, and Max Beerbohm is the son of a Latvian immigrant, right? So they are all English, but primarily in the sense that they have a claim to whiteness, right? Which is the biggest difference between them and Selke himself, right? That he's saying, I have just as much of a claim to Englishness or to the English language as these poets, right? But I don't have their claim to whiteness. And putting them together is sort of highlighting that, right? Saying that there are fissures in your own mythology about who belongs here and who doesn't. And so, in terms of the content of these epigraphs, right, part of what they're saying is history itself is a fiction that we tell ourselves. The Max Beerbohm line is, there's always something absurd about the past. And this is a quote from an essay called 1880, which is about, like, sartorial changes in, like, the late Edwardian or late 19th century. And he's sort of making fun of changes in fashion. And Selke is repurposing this quotation to point out the absurdity of colonial narratives of history and all that they leave out, right? Excuse me. And the quotation from T.S. Eliot is from Burnt Norton from 4 Quartets. It says, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. So basically, time is confusing. And the difference between the past and the future is basically sort of fiction of convenience that we tell ourselves, right? That also he's presenting these quotations in a new context, right? In the sense that these are opening epigraphs to a novel about the Caribbean migrant experience. And they are infusing a post-colonial critique into these statements that the past is always rather absurd, or that time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future and time future and time past, right? Saying what's come before has an impact on what's happening now, specifically in the sense that, we wouldn't be here if you weren't there, which was often graffitied on the walls in London in the 1950s, right? So he's also referencing another part of this poem, Four Quartets, which in Little Giddings says history is now in England. And he's saying, well, yeah, history is now in England, but that means something different to me than it does to you, Eliot, right? So then there's a big shift that happens in terms of Salke's approach to epigraphs with the second novel in this chapter, which was published in 1969. And I found evidence in correspondence that Salke actually delayed publication of this novel for several years, or, well, not purposely, he didn't delay it, but he couldn't get it published for several years after he wrote it, in part because there was a very explicit engagement with homosexuality in the text, that there are quote-unquote resolved homosexuals in the text that are like not repentant about it, and that made it difficult for him to get this book published in the mid-60s. So this particular text has a very different set of epigraphs, right? The previous text had epigraphs from these English figures like Beerbohm and Eliot and David Jones, who again was of Welsh background. And then the other epigraphs in that novel are from like Horace and Virgil, right? So calling back to this sort of classical tradition of the epigraph from the Latin. And then here we get these epigraphs from other Caribbean authors, right? So he's epigraphing Derek Walcott, who's already a pretty big deal at this point. V.S. Reed, right? Dennis Scott. He's looking at Stuart Hall, all these other Caribbean writers, and putting them in the position of the epigraphed, right? So they are now put in this space that is generally reserved for very established, very authoritative figures, right? So he's, in a sense, by placing them in that spot, he's conferring that authority on them, right? Or acknowledging that they belong in that space as much as a Shakespeare, as much as an Eliot, right? And one of the quotations that is in this novel is, even in his cities, man's life is grass. And this is from a Derek Walcott poem. And I sort of take this to be a way of puncturing the mythos of London as a beacon of culture and civilization, saying like, doesn't feel like that's what it is when you're there as a black migrant from Jamaica. And also thinking about the context of the Caribbean migrants' experience, right, of racist culture and exclusion. So, and the other thing about this novel that's kind of interesting and that I spent some time on in the chapter is the protagonist actually checks out books by some of these authors from a London library in the text, and they're sitting on the same shelves as like Francis Bacon, right? And he's saying, this is where we belong, right? We're just as much literature as these other guys. So that he's making that point both in the epigraphs in terms of a rhetorical gesture, but also literally saying in the text, like, we're on the same library shelves, guys. This is the same thing, right? Again, very sexy photo of Orlando Patterson. I love the glass of wine on the desk. So, Orlando Patterson is another Jamaican author. He's actually primarily known for his sociology work. He is a professor emeritus of sociology at Harvard, actually. He's still alive. And he is known for his work on, his sociology work on slavery, but he also, in the late 1960s, published several novels. And one of them is called An Absence of Ruins, and that's the one I'm talking about, which is a sort of satirical text that's talking about these activists and sort of making fun of how they're talking a big game about how they want to change everything, but part of how they are able to make all these arguments is that they have these educations that they have gotten through their success in the colonial system, right? That they're already in a slightly privileged position that feeds into the colonial structure, right? So they're the new bourgeoisie, right? The intelligentsia of Jamaica. And he's sort of making fun of them. And this chapter is a little weird. I mean, all my chapters are a little weird, but this one's particularly weird because I'm comparing a novel and an activist organization. So I'm talking about the Caribbean Artists Movement, which was a collective of Caribbean artists, authors, visual artists, musicians, who were living and working in London, again, because it was very difficult to make a living and work as an artist in the islands at the time. And so they were trying to promote a Caribbean artwork, right, in the interest of essentially crafting a political and cultural identity that was not just based in a response to colonialism, but as a part of a global artistic community, right? And especially one that spanned the entire African diaspora, right? And so they were trying to make connections with folks in Cuba as well. But one of the reasons that I wanted to put these things together is because Patterson was very involved in this movement, and this text is a very sharp satire about activism. And so I felt like this was sort of his two takes on it. On the one hand, he's like making fun of activists, but he's making fun of a particular kind of activist. And then with the other hand is being an activist himself, right? So the difference between what he thinks is performative activism versus like effective activism, and his clear investment in participating and claiming space in a global literary pantheon, right? And so in the novel, he has two epigraphs at the beginning, one of which is, again, by Derek Walcott, very popular guy, and the other is actually Bessie Smith, like the American blues singer Bessie Smith, which is wild, because she's the only woman and the only woman of color epigraphed by any of the texts that I've talked about so far, right? And so he's foregrounding these Caribbean and Black voices, but he's putting them in a context with the other epigraphs from the text, which include Milton, Shakespeare, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky, right? So he's not just pointing back to canonical figures in English literary traditions, right? He's also connecting to other literary and specifically philosophical traditions going on in other parts of the world. And this is also this is 1967 is when this text is published. This is also sort of the very nascent beginnings of the Black Power movement. And I am sort of arguing for a connection between the way that people like Patterson understand activism and their desire to be part of a larger global literary community, and specifically with other Black artists. Pardon me just a second. These pages do not want to come apart. So finally, just very briefly, I will give you a little taste of Walcott and what I think is going on in this particular epigraph, because this is the first epigraph from An Absence of Ruins. It's also where the title comes from, or this poem is where the title comes from. This poem is called The Royal Palms in Absence of Ruins. And this is Walcott saying, "Here there are no heroic places, nettled in sea-green vines, or built on maize savannas, the cat-thighed stony faces of Egypt's cradle, easily unriddled. If art is where the greatest ruins are, our art is in those ruins we became. You will not find in these green desert places one stone that found us worthy of its name, nor how, lacking the skills to beat things over flame, we peopled archipelagos by one star." And it's sort of, I'm making the case in my chapter that the key line there is our art is in those ruins we became. So even though we might read this as dismissive of the Caribbean in the sense that it doesn't have these monuments to culture that we expect to see in England, right, or in Europe, or even in Egypt, that he's saying our art is, right, that just because we don't have this kind of ruin, we don't have this kind of record, doesn't mean that the art is not there, right, that absence doesn't negate another kind of presence, right? And also, in those ruins we became, right, retaining and reinforcing the agency involved there, right, that we became something. It wasn't just something that was done to us, right? Even though the word ruins acknowledges the violence, the devastation, and the cruelty that was involved in that process. And now, we will move on to the capper, Michelle Cliff. She's a Jamaican author, and she spent much of her life in the U.S. She was actually the domestic partner of Adrienne Rich for 40 years. I feel like it's remarkable how few people know that. And she was bisexual. She and Rich were partners until Rich died in 2012. Cliff only died in 2016, I think. But No Telephone to Heaven is, in a certain way, another novel about activism, or at least about activists. The main figure in the novel, Claire, her name's Claire Savage. She's born and raised in Jamaica. She's of mixed racial heritage. She spends part of her young life in New York. Her family moves to New York. And then she comes back to Jamaica, and then she goes to England to study, and then she comes back to Jamaica again. And one of the things that she experiences is, during her time in England, she becomes very disillusioned with the sort of cultural narrative of English superiority, or the narrative of English cultural superiority, I should say. So this novel it has 9 epigraphs for 11 chapters. There are 2 chapters without epigraphs, and that's kind of significant for reasons I'll explain in a second. But one of the things that's unique about Cliff's novel is the diversity of her epigraphs, that she pulls epigraphs from a whole host of different sources, right? It's not just from novels or poems, although she also doesn't just pull from English works. She also includes some quotations from Césaire in the original French. But she also quotes Yoruban hymns and Jamaican proverbs. And so she's playing with the idea that not only do you not need to have divisions in terms of who gets to be epigraphed, you don't need to necessarily have barriers in terms of what can be an epigraph, right? That you can push beyond these barriers or expectations of genre. That epigraphs don't just have to come from like poetry and novels and things that we think of as like literary or authoritative, right? So a little bit more context for No Telephone. That this was published in 1987. So we're talking about 20 plus years after Jamaican independence, right? So we've had a full generation post-independence to kind of see what that starts to look like and what's going on in terms of politically with Jamaica. And then we also have the U.S.-led incursion into Grenada in 1983, right? So we have shifted from colonialism to neocolonialism, essentially, right? That we're moving into U.S. imperialism not moving into, because it's been going on, but there's a new form of U.S. imperialism, I should say, in the Caribbean. So a lot of what Cliff's novel is talking about is cultural manipulation and cultural appropriation. And the first epigraph is, again, Derek Walcott, star of the show. And this is from his poem, which is called Laventille. And Laventille is the name of a slum in Port of Spain, which is the capital of Trinidad and Tobago. Walcott, by the way, is a poet from St. Lucia. He's also of mixed racial heritage, just to give you that background. But Laventille is talking about this particular place in Port of Spain. But in choosing this moment from Walcott's poem as the opening epigraph to her novel, Cliff is sort of forcing readers to confront this moment, right? So let me just read this briefly. Something inside is laid wide like a wound, some open passage that has cleft the brain, some deep amnesiac blow. We left somewhere a life we never found, customs and goals that are not born again, some crib, some grill of light clanged shut on us in bondage and withheld us from that world below us and beyond. And in its swaddling cerements we're still bound. So Walcott is drawing a direct connection between the present day conditions of Laventille and the wide wound of the Middle Passage, right? And its ongoing resonances in Caribbean life, and specifically its economic after effects. So in order to access Cliff's novel, Cliff's text, one must reckon with the threshold, right? The direct connection between the Middle Passage and the conditions and the very existence of places like Laventille. So the next moment I want to give you a little bit of sketch of is from a later chapter, and this is the epigraph to the chapter in which Claire has this moment of disillusionment while she's living in England. And this quotation is from Aurora Leigh, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's first novel. And the context of this quotation is the child it references is Marion, who is a poor seamstress, and her mother has attempted to sell her as a child bride. And Marion's story is a sort of parallel for England's betrayal of Jamaica as its supposed mother country, right? Rather than care for her child, the mother seeks to profit from its exploitation, right? And it says, the child turned around and looked up piteous in the mother's face. "Oh, mother," then with desperate glance to heaven, "God, free me from my mother," she shrieked out, "these mothers are too dreadful," which is just a great line. But so Cliff's reader can sort of map Barrett Browning's piteous child onto the colonized Jamaica and perceive England in the role of the too dreadful mother from whom all colonized peoples, and Claire, the main character in particular, is seeking the means to be free. And so by using Barrett Browning as the epigraph, Cliff is attending to this complex matrix of structural positions within the hierarchies of race, gender, and class to subvert the dominant English narrative. And Cliff selects a woman's voice to undermine the patriarchal framings of England's canon, while also reminding readers that slave labor in Jamaica produced much of England's wealth, as in the case of Barrett Browning's own family specifically, right? That most of their money came from plantations in the Caribbean. And interestingly, Barrett Browning sometimes gets included in like lists of Black English authors. It's a very debated question. There's a lot of people who challenge that characterization, but she definitely was vocally in favor of abolition of slavery. And so there's an interesting way in which Cliff is sort of acknowledging the source of her ability to produce this kind of work is from this wealth, but also she can find that moment of solidarity with another woman, especially another woman invested in the abolition of slavery. Excuse me. And the last one I'll talk about is the last epigraph of the text. To give you a quick gloss on those two chapters without epigraphs. So there's this moment of disillusionment that Claire has in England. And the two chapters after that are the ones that don't have an epigraph. So it's like there's this space opening for the possibility of something new coming in, right? But it also replicates that sort of wide wound, that deep amnesiac blow that the opening epigraph is talking about, right? That once you take away the English narrative about her history, she has to take some time to figure out what it is that she thinks about it, right? What is her own narrative of that history going to be? And then the last epigraph is from Walcott, another Walcott poem, Derek Walcott, all over the place. This is a poem called Jean Reese. So even though we have Derek Walcott again, she also manages to get at least the name of another woman Caribbean writer in there. And this precedes the chapter Film Noir, in which so Claire and another character, Harriet, have joined this like resistance collective, and they're trying to prevent or circumvent the Hollywoodization of the history of Jamaica, because there's this film production about the figure of Nanny, who was the leader of the Maroons, and they're trying to trouble this film production because they know that they're going to Hollywoodize Jamaica's history and use it to serve their own purposes, right? So in direct opposition to this revisionist narrative of appropriation, the epigraph shows Walcott as a writer of color revising the dominant narrative of colonialism and infusing it with the perspective of the present-day Caribbean. So he says, in their faint photographs modeled with chemicals, like the left hand of some spinster aunt, they have drifted to the edge, bone-collared gentlemen with spiked mustaches, and their wives embayed in the wickerwork armchairs, all looking colored from the distance of a century, beginning to groan sideways from the axe stroke. Brown moonlight, and a moon so sallow, so pharmaceutical, that her face is a feverish child, some malarial angel, whose grave still cowers under a fury of bush, a mania of wild yams wrangling to hide her from ancestral churchyards. So Walcott notes from his present perspective that as the photographs have darkened with time, their subjects are all, quote, looking colored from the distance of a century, which is highlighting both racial intermixing that's taken place and also the idea that people of color are not so different from white people that they cannot be interchangeable with a simple shift in perspective, although that shift has taken over 100 years. And you also see these aesthetic changes that he's making, right? Moonlight is frequently used as a synecdoche for paleness, and here moonlight is brown, right? And then he describes the gentleman as bone-collared, which highlights the violence lurking under the bourgeois surface of colonialism, and also invokes the cruelty involved in producing and obtaining the cotton for those shirts. So basically what I'm arguing in this chapter is that if you look at Cliff's epigraphs in their totality, they form this kind of meta-narrative of resistance to cultural appropriation and manipulation that's taking place in Jamaica. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting about this work on Cliff is that it engages this other linguistic register because she has some epigraphs that are in French. And so I thought, well, I should really look at how other language traditions are using it. If I'm going to really make a case for how epigraphs are functioning in quote-unquote Caribbean fiction, I have to consider other language traditions beyond the Anglophone, but also I need my dissertation to be done, so so that will wait. And now I'm trying to start doing some of that work in my new chapters, which are hopefully going to focus on a couple of texts in Spanish and a couple of texts in French. I think I'm going to focus on Patrick Chamoiseau's Chronique de cette misère, and then hopefully also Maurice Condé's Moi Titube, in terms of the French. And then the Spanish text, I have started with El Siglo de las Luces by Alejo Carpentier. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of what that's going to look like, I will look at some of the layers of intertextuality in the Carpentier novel. So just some background before I get into this. Carpentier he publishes this novel, El Siglo de las Luces, in 1962. This is set in the late 18th, early 19th century. El Siglo de las Luces is the Spanish term for like the Age of Enlightenment. It means the Century of Lights, although that's not the English title of the novel, which I'll get to in a second. But so this story follows three young Cubans, siblings Sofia and Carlos, and their cousin Esteban. Don't worry, you don't need to remember those names. As they navigate their individual journeys through the French and Haitian revolutions, and the novel ends just after the beginning of Napoleon's war with Spain. So one of the main characters in this novel is a historical figure, Victor Hugues. I apologize if I'm butchering that French pronunciation. He was an actual French merchant who became an agent of the French Revolution during its Jacobinist phase. And real events in Carpentier's fiction, real events show up in Carpentier's fiction, but he recasts this period in history to demonstrate the central role of the Caribbean in what is conventionally thought of as European history, right? That everybody thinks about the French Revolution and they forget that the Haitian Revolution was a big part of that, right? And so the epigraphs come from three sources, one of which is the Zohar, and the other of which are the Book of Job, and the rest are captions from Francisco Goya's famous series of prints, which are commonly known as Los Desastres de la Guerra. And so he's invoking this variety of epistemologies. We have the visual, the mystical, and the allegorical. So this epigraph from the Zohar, which, let me preface, I am not a Jewish mysticism expert at all. But my understanding is that this is a foundational text in Jewish mystical literature of the Kabbalah. The quotation is, "Las palabras no caen en el vacío," which means words do not fall into the void. And so part of what I take from that is language is always contextual, right? So when we hear the quotation from the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, you know, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. You know, these words do not fall into the void. They fall into the ears of enslaved peoples throughout the Caribbean, right? And key figures in the Haitian Revolution have said that they took inspiration from this document. But Carpentier's novel also rather pointedly reminds the reader that this declaration served as merely an apparent acknowledgement by white men of that which people of color already knew, right? And the foundation of the Zohar is a foundational text in terms of the body of literature known as the Kabbalah, and it sort of offers a commentary on the Torah that's emphasizing ethical principles and the moral perfection of man, right? Perfection being a process and not a state of being. So, as described by Boston Globe writer Ezra Glinter, the Zohar is intentionally obscure. Its language is full of neologisms, linguistic borrowings, occasional grammatical mistakes, and inspired wordplay on rabbinic and biblical passages. Its ideas are often paradoxical and contradictory, referring to esoteric concepts that are never fully spelled out. And yet, the word Zohar comes from the Aramaic. It means radiance or light. So you have this interplay between light and, or the illumination of divine inspiration, and then the dark, the sort of obscurity and confusion that's going on there. And this is very familiar to anybody who's read Carpentier's work at all. And you also have the text rather than an author in the position of authority here, right? The text is telling us how we should be reading this history. So, as I said, the rest of the epigraphs come from captions from these prints of Goya's. And they frame Goya as both an artist and an author, since he's credited as the author of the epigraph or the quotation. And these are commonly known as Los Desastres de la Guerra, but actually the name that they were given by Goya is Fatales Consecuencias de la Sangrienta Guerra en España con Bonaparte y otros caprichos infantios. So he's connecting the events of the novel to their immediate aftermath and the fatales consecuencias, or the fatal consequences of this bloody war. And so Carpentier, or at least the placement of this epigraph, are both highlighting the specific historical moment, because what Goya is talking about is what happens immediately after the events of the novel, but he's also doing the same thing that has been done to Goya's work and sort of allegorizing this to the concepts of war and revolution more generally, for a broader political statement about the human costs of war and oppression and their impact on vulnerable groups, specifically the poor and women. And so Carpentier is also invoking a visual register in the text. One of the things that comes up a lot in the text is there's this sort of thematic line about the painting, which is called Explosion in a Cathedral. And that's what they decided to make the title for the novel in English. So it's published in English under the title Explosion in a Cathedral. It's weird. Anyway, so this work by Goya is a significant stylistic departure, not just from his earlier work, but also from like what was typical of the time. He's using these intaglio techniques of engraving and etching for a chiaroscuro effect. And so you see, again, that sort of interplay between light and dark and the heightened contrast, making the images sort of more stark, right? And Carpentier actually discusses in an interview the so-called Enlightenment age. Is primarily known for its philosophical developments, but it's also one of the bloodiest centuries in recorded history, with an economy based on slavery, conditions of repression, violent punishments, mass slaughter of protesters, right? And the character of Victor Hugues, so the way he's drawn in Carpentier's novel, he sort of embodies these hypocrisies, sort of aligning himself with whatever stance is politically expedient and best serves his own purposes, regardless of any ethical concerns. And this particular image sort of suggests the idea of Victor putting on these revolutionary ideals like someone else's clothes, or taking whatever profit he can glean from a situation. So this image is soldiers taking clothes off of dead bodies, and the caption is "se aprovechan," which means they avail themselves, sort of with the connotation of taking advantage. And the last caption of the novel comes from a sketch that depicts a group of murdered monks lying in the foreground while French soldiers loot church treasures. And the caption is "Así sucedió," which means this is how it happened. But the certainty of that statement is very much in contrast with the ambiguity in the novel about precisely what actually happens to two of the main characters, Esteban and Sofia. They are presumed dead after taking to the streets of Madrid in the 2nd of May, 1808 uprising against the occupying Napoleon French troops. But we don't ever find out for sure what happens to them. So if we take this last caption in a more allegorical spirit, it might suggest that this is how it happened, which is the violent plundering of the sacred, whether that's liturgically or philosophically sacred, in the name of power. So the last word I will give you is sort of what I hope this project will go on to do or go on to lead me toward. Susan Stanford Freeman is a narrative theory scholar who published an article in 2011, toward a transnational turn in narrative theory. And she's making the case for working to what she calls engage with the frictions of incommensurability as narrative forms from distinctive global and temporal locations are examined. She's arguing that narrative theory that is, quote, tested for its explanatory power with a limited literary archive will replicate the limitations of that archive. So what I'm hoping to do in my work is start to push the limits of that archive, right, and begin to test narrative theories against a more diverse archive, and think about how we might be able to create narrative theories that are attuned to the sort of structural particularities of post-colonial literature and its diasporic valences. And sort of, again, in response to the hemispheric blindness that Biwu Shang is talking about in his article Towards a Comparative Narratology, a Chinese Perspective, that we might try to move beyond the Eurocentric and Anglo-American model by expanding the scope of toolkits and archives for analysis. So my goal here is to produce something like a borderless study of the epigraph in the interest of engaging with broader regional questions about the Caribbean and also ideas about narrative theory that aren't bound up in these Eurocentric traditions. Thank you very much. See everybody at Founders Day.
Oh, questions?
Sorry, happy to take questions.
I actually have two. One is just logistics.
Yeah.
Do these authors have to do anything to put an epigraph? Do they have to cite it somewhere, or can they just plunk it into their?
Generally, I think the expectation is just to put the name of whoever wrote the epigraph at the bottom and you're good. It's interesting, a lot of publishers get grumpy if you want to include an epigraph, especially more than one. And so sometimes they would have to make a case for it. But it does seem like that you can kind of take it from wherever you want, right? That there's not really any limits except past precedent, right? That people aren't expecting epigraphs to come from these different sources like the ones Cliff is citing in the 80s. So the expectation is that you can take an epigraph from anywhere you want to, right? The question is, what do you want that epigraph to say? Basically.
So that actually makes me have a middle question.
Okay.
What if the person that you epigraphed from isn't happy with how you use their words preceding your words? Do they have the right to say, I want my words taken out of your text?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that that might sort of reinforce the tendency to epigraph from dead people. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I would imagine as long as you're citing them, yeah, it would potentially, I don't know, maybe they do have to get permission if the author's still alive. That's a great question. I've not actually ever considered that.
Under copyright, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, once it's out of your hands, as an author, you have no control of other people like what you're doing. So, and I mean, most of this looks like Shakespeare doesn't care.
Well, and the other thing, especially about relationships between somebody like Andrew Zalke and Derek Walcott, whose poetry he's quoting, those guys knew each other, they were buddies, right? So, some of it has to do with actual personal relationships between these people, right? Although that obviously wasn't always going to be the case.
So then my third question becomes, I will show my total literary ignorance, because I feel like reading these epigraphs and then highlighting, which I totally got, it was fascinating how that then recasts or gives authority to what the author's about to say.
Mm-hmm.
But me, totally unliterary, I'm going to read this Derek Walcott thing and not know who he is or what it meant or anything. I might do the opposite. I might read the text and then go back and try to understand what that epigraph was doing there in terms of what it was, how it was connected to what that text was.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might just read it at the beginning and then read the text and then not go back and read it at all. So do you have to really be literarily based in your reading to get the gist of what these epigraphs are trying to do?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm working with a colleague of mine on a piece that hopefully will come out in an edited collection in the next year or two about the idea of co-construction, which is a narrative theory that says that the text only exists in as much as it is read by a reader. So the text is always a co-construction between the reader and the author, and I think that the author can only do so much in terms of the meaning that the reader takes from the text, right? Like he or she can, whoever can present their intent, right? Present their message, and try to give clues for the rhetorical reader, meaning their ideal or expected reader. But they have no control over how readers actually respond to the text, right? So I would say that they may have a very specific intention in placing that epigraph there, but that doesn't mean that that's how you're going to take or interpret what they've placed there, right? And I think especially, a lot of people skip over the epigraph, or, they don't notice it until they go back and read it a second time maybe, or the epigraph only makes sense after they've read the whole text, and they don't think about it as like a framing device. So I think in terms of the reader's interpretation of the epigraph, there's not necessarily a wrong way to interpret it, right? There's just how you interpret it and your construction of the relationship between, the intertextual relationship between the epigraph and the text itself, right? So I don't know that there's a wrong way to interpret it. There's maybe a way that the author might anticipate you interpreting it, but that doesn't determine what readers are actually going to think when they read it.
I kind of have a similar question. I was wondering about the term epigraph itself. The graph part I get, but what about the epi? And I can be more specific if you want.
In terms of like the Greek?
Yeah, because he was the guy who looked back. He was kind of a doofus.
Who was?
Epichenus.
Oh.
His older brother looked forward. He was a smart guy, but he looked backward. He's the doofus, kind of. But when did they name this after him?
My understanding is that it's epi in the sense of like on top of the text, right?
So it's not necessarily that something looking backward is introducing something that you read forward.
No, not necessarily. And there's
the prefix epi is a Greek
Yeah.
word that just means on the preposition.
So it's not related, not related to the god.
No,
I don't think so. No.
And we're
it's a
good.
grammar word from Greek.
So,
Yeah, it's more to do with the relationship of the pieces of text, right? And things that are part of the text around this, what we think of like as being the main text, for instance, of like a novel, are considered epitext, right? So epitext can be an epigraph, but it can also be like a dedication or, I don't know, a blurb on the back of the book even, right? That all of these things are epitext in the sense that they're on the fringes of what is the main text.
thank you.
Did you quote anything as in your dissertation or your chapters as an epigraph for your dissertation?
Yes, my dissertation did have epigraphs, yeah. Yeah. I also got to quote from a Ian Fleming novel, James Bond novel, which was a great moment in my life. Because when, at the beginning of Escape to an Autumn Pavement, the character, it's in first person, it's narrated in first person, and the character introduces himself as Sobert, Johnny Sobert. And I had to, right? Like, of course he's referencing James Bond, right? But he's also referencing the character whose very origin is in the sort of decline of the British Empire, and it's, the reduction of the relevance of British military power. So.
I have one final question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Do you feel like sometimes, like, if you had to have the joke explained to you, like the joke wasn't intended for you? Do you feel like sometimes, like, this analyzing of, and, like, publicly writing about this is, like, kind of getting at, like, maybe it might make the original authors, like, sort of grumpy, but, well, if you have to have the joke explained to you, I'm just feeling like at what point does the analyzing kind of defeat the purpose of maybe, like, the odd, like, the sort of in the know aspect, or, like, does that make sense? Does the question make sense?
I think so. I think of it in terms of there's a difference between enjoying a novel and analyzing a novel. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Sometimes it's fun, at least for me, otherwise why would I be doing this, to like really pick these things apart. But it also doesn't necessarily prevent me from enjoying the experience of reading it. I mean, I'm a post-colonial literary scholar, and one of my favorite books is Jane Eyre. Like, the cognitive dissonance there is unbelievable, right? So I think it's possible, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, it's possible to not necessarily have to analyze something, like to be able to enjoy a reading experience without having to analyze it, but it's also possible to enjoy the analysis of it. In terms of whether that would make the author grumpy, I really don't care.
The author knows why they put the epigraph there. No one else does. Maybe their agent or their study that they co-wrote with or something, right? But in the end, we are there to do analysis, and that's our job. And yeah, we still have fun.
Well, and I feel like I spend a great deal of time trying to tell my students in like my gen ed classes, like, you don't know what the author meant. No one knows what the author meant. The author might not even know what the author meant, right? But like, what matters is what you understood from it. Like, this is again, going back to this idea of co-construction, right? The text is co-constructed by the author and the reader, that the reader is as much a part of the experience of the text and its meaning as the author is.
The author might be
And kind of a comment on what Amy is saying, and no offense, of course, to my historians here, but in absence of a formal recorded history in places where there probably wasn't a structure for formal recorded history, such as revolutionary Caribbean times, right? There's so much to unpack in these culturally, that to pick these apart and find these little nuances, whether it's through narrative theory or sociological theory. There are context clues about the history and the culture there that we might never know otherwise, because there wasn't a formal recorded history.
And I also hope that one of the reasons I call my project Radical Canons is that I'm pushing back on this idea that you can only produce radical energy by deconstructing a canon, that like constructing a canon can also be a radical thing, right? And so part of what I'm trying to sort of engage with is this question of what even is literary authority and what purposes does it serve? So thinking about, who do we think of as counting as literature, and to what purpose, right? What is their value, and what is their role in our greater sort of understanding or conception of literature and literary culture and its relationship to, for instance, political culture, right? Because, people's texts are both influential but also reflective of the moment that they come from, right? So how are we understanding the relationship between authority and this idea of a canon and what we consider to count as literature and who we value there? Any other questions? Thank you very much. Sorry I tried to run away.